What if I told you the most shocking truth about the Beatles' breakup wasn't revealed in 1970, when the band split, but more than 50 years later? What if everything you thought you knew, the bitter fights, the creative tensions, the whispers about Yoko Ono, was only part of the story? For decades, fans have argued about what brought the Beatles to an end. Was it Paul McCartney's perfectionism? George Harrison's frustrations at being overshadowed? Ringo Starr's exhaustion? Or John Lennon's desire to step away with Yoko Ono? Finally, at 82 years old, Paul McCartney broke his silence, and what he revealed changes everything. This is the real story of how the most famous band in history came to an end. The rise of a revolution. Before the legend, before the mania, before the stadiums full of screaming fans, there were just four boys from Liverpool. John Lennon was born in 1940 during the Blitz, bombs falling over his hometown. His childhood was marked by instability. His father was often absent, and his mother drifted in and out of his life. But music gave John an anchor. He strummed banjos, tinkered with guitars, and let himself be swept away by the raw power of rock and roll. Elvis Presley became his hero, showing him that music could be rebellious, dangerous, and liberating. In 1956, John formed a skiffle band called the Quarrymen. They played local gigs, rough around the edges, but full of energy. Then, one summer afternoon in 1957, fate stepped in. A friend introduced John to a young boy named Paul McCartney at a church fair. Paul was just 15, but he could tune a guitar upside down and play chords John hadn't mastered. John saw instantly that this wasn't just another kid with a guitar. Paul had the spark. By the end of the day, John had invited him to join the Quarrymen. It was the start of one of the most legendary partnerships in music history. Paul's childhood had been different from John's. His mother, a nurse, and his father, a jazz pianist, gave him a stable home until tragedy struck. When Paul was 14, his mother died suddenly of cancer. That grief could have broken him, but instead it pushed him deeper into music. Writing songs became his way of making sense of loss. Soon after Paul joined, he brought along his friend George Harrison. George was quiet, even shy, but his talent on the guitar was undeniable. At just 14, he impressed John with his skill, and though John thought he was too young at first, George earned his place in the group. Years later, in 1962, they completed the lineup with Ringo Starr, a drummer with both charisma and resilience. He had survived serious childhood illnesses, spent years in hospitals, and emerged with a drive that fit perfectly with the band's determination. Together, John, Paul, George, and Ringo became something new, the Beatles. But they weren't an overnight sensation. In Hamburg, Germany, they learned the hard way, playing endless sets in clubs, sleeping in cramped rooms, and barely scraping by. Yet, those grueling nights forged them into one of the tightest bands in the world. Back in Liverpool, at the Cavern Club, they became local legends. It was here that Brian Epstein, a young record store owner, first saw them. Epstein wasn't just impressed, he saw destiny. He polished their look, got them out of leather jackets and into sharp suits, and began knocking on doors of record companies. After several rejections, including the infamous Decca audition where they were told guitar groups are on the way out, they finally landed with George Martin at EMI's Parlophone label. Martin's classical training and willingness to experiment blended with the Beatles' raw creativity in ways that would change music forever. Their first single, Love Me Do, made the charts in 1962. Their second, Please Please Me, hit #1. And from there, the Beatles exploded. By 1963, Beatlemania swept Britain. By 1964, they were on American soil, performing for 73 million viewers on The Ed Sullivan Show. Within weeks, they had conquered America, and soon after, the entire world. They weren't just a band anymore. They were a cultural force. Everywhere they went, fans screamed, fainted, and mobbed them. Their records topped charts, their movies drew crowds, and their faces became icons of the 1960s. But fame that burns so bright always leaves scars, cracks in the crown. By 1966, the Beatles had reached a breaking point with touring. The screaming was so loud they couldn't hear themselves play. Security was a nightmare. Their music was evolving, but on stage, they were trapped in the past, unable to reproduce their new sounds live. Their last official concert took place in San Francisco's Candlestick Park in August 1966. Afterward, they made a decision that stunned the world. No more tours. Instead, the studio became their playground, and from it came some of the greatest albums in history. Revolver pushed rock into new territory. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band redefined what an album could be, an artwork in itself. Songs like A Day in the Life and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds showed how far they could stretch the boundaries of popular music. But behind the masterpieces, tension was building. Paul thrived on discipline, often driving the sessions with relentless energy. John, meanwhile, was drifting further into experimental art with Yoko Ono. George, now an accomplished songwriter in his own right, grew frustrated at how little of his work made it onto albums. Ringo sometimes felt like an outsider altogether. Then, in 1967, tragedy struck. Brian Epstein, the man who had guided their career from obscurity to global fame, died of a drug overdose. His death was more than a personal loss. It was a turning point. Without Epstein's steady hand, the Beatles were left to handle business themselves, and cracks quickly widened. Disputes over management made matters worse. Paul wanted his in-laws, the Eastmans, to handle their affairs. John, George, and Ringo threw their support behind Alan Klein, a tough American businessman. This split in loyalty poisoned the atmosphere and deepened divides. Musically, the Beatles were still capable of brilliance. The White Album in 1968 showcased their range, but also their divisions. Many songs were recorded separately. George stormed out at one point. Ringo even quit for 2 weeks, fed up with the fighting. Then came the Get Back sessions in early 1969. The idea was simple: return to their roots, play live, and recapture the joy of their early days. Instead, it became a nightmare. Cameras caught them bickering. The tension was so thick that George temporarily left the band. Yet somehow, even in the middle of chaos, the Beatles delivered one final masterpiece. In 1969, they recorded Abbey Road. With songs like Come Together, Something, and the medley on side 2, it felt like a grand farewell, even if they didn't say it out loud. On January 30th, 1969, the Beatles climbed onto the rooftop of Apple Corps in London for their last ever public performance. For fans on the street, it was magical. For the band, it was bittersweet. That rooftop performance symbolized the height of their genius and the beginning of the end. The truth about the end. For decades, history painted Paul McCartney as the man who broke up the Beatles. On April 10, 1970, Paul announced he was leaving the band, shocking fans worldwide. To the press, it seemed clear. Paul ended it. But at 82, Paul finally set the record straight. According to Paul, it wasn't him at all. It was John. Months before Paul's announcement, John Lennon had already told the band privately that he was done. He wanted freedom, independence, and the chance to create on his own terms with Yoko Ono by his side. Paul's statement wasn't the cause of the breakup. It was the confirmation. The truth is more complicated than the myths. Yes, Yoko's presence in the studio was controversial. Yes, Paul's drive sometimes grated on the others. Yes, George felt undervalued, and Ringo felt stuck in the middle. And yes, the battle over management drove wedges between them. But ultimately, the Beatles didn't implode because of one argument or one person. They ended because they had grown into four men with different dreams, different priorities, and different lives. The legal battle dragged on until 1974, but spiritually, the Beatles ended the moment John walked away. Paul simply had the burden of telling the world. And maybe that's the most human truth of all. The Beatles weren't gods, even if they sometimes seemed like it. They were friends, collaborators, brothers, and, like all families, they eventually drifted apart. Their breakup wasn't a tragedy. It was the natural end of a story that had already given the world everything. At 82, Paul McCartney finally revealed the truth. It was John Lennon who first left the Beatles. Paul wasn't the villain history made him out to be. He was the messenger of an ending that was already written. The Beatles' story didn't end in bitterness. It ended because they had already scaled the highest peaks imaginable. Their legacy remains untouchable. Their music still inspires, still moves, still unites generations. So here's the real question. Was their ending sad, or was it simply the closing of the greatest chapter in music history? Because while the Beatles may have ended, their songs never will. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure you stick around. We've got more hidden stories of music legends coming your way. And let me know, which Beatles song do you think best captures the spirit of their journey?